What's up, and welcome back to Inside Gaming Weekend Edition. We're still here. We're still in social quarantine. Today, I'm your host, obviously the king of the hottest takes on the internet, Evan Campbell, and we're going to be taking a look at the history of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. To help me out, I've reached out to Resident Evil PhD and historian Amir Ramirez. Welcome, Professor.
Hello, everyone. It is I.
And lore master of fine Resident Evil arts, Caden Jensen. Greetings, Caden.
Yes. And I also know how to make a hell of a Jill sandwich.
Don't we all at this point?
Can you make me one?
Oh, yeah.
With the help of Amir and Caden, my hope is that we can dive into some interesting game history and maybe even provide you with a new perspective on Resident Evil 3, a game that's often brushed off as just one of the weaker entries in what I would say is a legendary franchise. And of course, it'd be hard to talk about Resident Evil 3 this weekend without talking about the recent reception of Resident Evil 3 Remake.
Yeah, totally. Resident Evil 3 Remake is finally out, and while the reviews have averaged to a decent Metacritic score of 80, some major outlets and critics really took the game to task.
Yeah, for example, GameSpot tentatively gave it a 6 and said, quote, as a remake, Resident Evil 3 not only falls short of honoring its source, but it also doesn't quite stick the landing as a standalone horror experience.
Not sure if I agree with that, but Eurogamer also said, the Resident Evil 3 remake, like the original, upon which it is based, is inferior to its predecessor.
Oh, jeez. Yeah, lastly, Vice Gaming's headline for the review simply says, Resident Evil 3 is a boring disappointment. Oh, man,
Come on!
I never thought I'd hear those words, to be honest with you.
I don't think any of us agree with a lot of these takes here.
Not at all.
Resident Evil 3 has kind of got a history behind it.
Yeah.
It does, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So I thought this was an interesting case of video game history simply repeating itself. You know, Resident Evil 3 is usually thought of as a divisive game because it's considered to be a very clear breaking point where the franchise veered away from survival horror and moved much more into action horror. I mean, that's where probably a lot of these critiques kind of originate from. However, when I went to look back at old reviews for the original Resident Evil 3, I found that a lot of major gaming publications at the time really seemed to like it. So let's do a thing. I'm gonna set up these quotes and then you guys can read them, pretend to be from 1990.
Cool.
Computer and Video Games, aka CVG, gave it a 9 out of 10, stating,
The first two games set the standard for survival horror, smothering gamers in gore and leaving them screaming for more. Now the third unholy incarnation is here to show all the pretenders how it's really done. Was that 90s?
nice.
It's fantastic.
GameSpot at the time gave it an 8.8 and said,
Judging on its own merit, Resident Evil 3 is a truly outstanding game. Unlike other series, Street Fighter, Tomb Raider, that offer incremental improvements, the RE lineup continues to refine an already excellent premise. This is a series with legs, and each new chapter does nothing to diminish it. How was that one?
real big brain tone there. Yeah, it's seems spot on.
That was pretty good.
And Cho, participating in the review crew over at EGM, gave it an 8.5, saying,
Resident Evil was gripping from beginning to end.
and even added that,
It has better balance than Resident Evil 2 between action and puzzles.
sure, some of these reviews had offered criticism as well, which I want to talk about, but the positivity around the reception of Resident Evil 3 doesn't really match its legacy, I don't think.
No, actually, Resident Evil 3 not only did well and was well reviewed, it actually sold like crazy. It did real good, and it wasn't even the real quote-unquote Resident Evil 3. That was being made by other people at the time. This was supposed to be like 1.9.
Sales-wise, you know, it didn't do nearly as much as Resident Evil 2 or Resident Evil 1 even, but it still sold.
Yeah, and they had a year to make this game. This is that whole, let's take what we already have and make something new with it. This is like Ocarina of Time to Majora's Mask, but with a Resident Evil game.
Yeah, what were the circumstances that molded Resident Evil 3 to be kind of a divisive game? And my bigger question, I guess, is even with the fresh coat of paint, which is the Resident Evil 3 remake, is it destined to live in the shadow of Resident Evil 2?
So yeah, let's take it all the way back. Initially, Hideki Kamiya, famed game maker and director of Resident Evil 2, Devil May Cry, Beautiful Joe, Okami, and, you know, he would be known as like the chief game designer at Platinum Games, Bayonetta, Vanquish, Nier Automata, Wonderful 101, was originally working on what was called Resident Evil 3 at the time.
Right, yeah, it was supposed to feature Hunk from RE2 trapped on a luxury cruise liner as he tried to secure a sample of the G-Virus. However, Sony announced the PS2 and Kamiya's Resident Evil project wasn't going to be done until after the PS2's release. So it was canceled and Kamiya's team was moved on to Resident Evil 4 at the time, which would actually become Devil May Cry, and that still blows my mind till this day.
Yeah, those fixed camera angles in Devil May Cry kind of tell a little bit of a story there, but this whole thing left Capcom with a dilemma in which they didn't want to keep fans waiting too long for the next mainline entry of Resident Evil, and they wanted to round out the trilogy on the original PlayStation before the launch of the PS2. they had to have something out, and they were keeping their actual numbered Resident Evil games on PlayStation, and then they also had the other games, the additive games, on other platforms as well. So they actually took this Resident Evil and they started to make a spin-off, and then they upgraded it into an actual Resident Evil 3. And because of this brash move, the concept and narrative design, which was originally handled by an independent developer known as Flagship, was instead developed by an internal Capcom writer named Yasuhisa Kawamura, who didn't have a ton of Resident Evil knowledge and wasn't even actually a big writer.
Yeah, and despite that, an inexperienced team under director Kazuhiro Aoyama still managed to pull off some cool technical feats and flourishes, like improved AI and the T-1000-inspired Nemesis system, and they shipped the game we know today as Resident Evil 3 Nemesis.
Yeah, so it's pretty clear that Resident Evil 3 faced some challenges even before it was officially supposed to be Resident Evil 3. And even, I guess, the old school publications that gave Resident Evil 3 good scores had some decent points and criticisms. A weaker story, a shorter length. A lot of people criticize it in reviews that I read, like for not having a zapping system to switch between characters. Are these criticisms kind of fair?
For me, I always saw Resident Evil 3 as the superior game. For one, they did a lot of things right that I feel like Resident Evil 2 should have done. For example, the dodge mechanic and being able to go up and down stairs without having to press X, was it? Just small little quality of life improvements like that made the game better for me. I understand why people have this sort of gripe with RE3 as opposed to RE2, but honestly, given the amount of time that they had to work on that game, they did pretty damn good. And look what came out of it. I mean, we got Nemesis, who's like one of the most iconic video game villains in the history of video games.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. I mean, Resident Evil 2 does have Mr. X, and now we have all these great memes about Mr. X in Resident Evil 2 Remake, but in the original, he was just kind of there, but Nemesis was threatening. Nemesis was always there and kept coming back, so there was a quick turning thing. There was a lot of little things that made Resident Evil 3 just slightly better. But I do kind of agree a little bit with that shorter length, and I do understand that people were kind of upset about the less playable characters and less things to do, but it did have some really cool additive things to it that would propel the series forward and eventually help make Resident Evil 4 as good as it was.
Yeah, I think that's probably a big takeaway that I've seen in a lot of the research that I did, just looking up and reading all these different reviews of the original Resident Evil 3. It did introduce some new things into the series, like you said, the quick turnaround and that dodging sidestep. A lot of people talked about the timing for it. They added auto aim and stuff, because remember in original Resident Evils, you actually had to tilt the controller up and you couldn't really get it in the middle. You were either way up in the sky or way down at your feet, and hopefully it would hit.
You had to kind of do that weird maneuver where you swing the right joystick up as you're shooting.
Yeah,
oh,
right.
It's just you just gotta fiddle with it a little bit. It's I finally got that headshot that I needed.
Yeah.
I also didn't realize that Resident Evil 3 was the first introduction of the mercenary mode, which was really, really cool in Resident Evil 4 as well. And then on the technical side, they had actually introduced exploding barrels, and a lot of games had exploding barrels by this point, but for it to be in Resident Evil, I think was kind of interesting. And just the idea of having more varied zombies too was another technical feat that this team was able to kind of solve at the end of the PlayStation 1's life cycle, right?
Yeah, but then they also had the whole issue of not having enough development time to actually put in, the coolest parts of Resident Evil, which are the overwhelmingly neat bosses, like the giant snakes and the alligator. They had 2.
That's a good point, actually.
Nemesis is this threat, but the actual bosses in the game are kind of forgettable.
I totally agree with you, kid. And I don't know if it was intentional, but it almost feels like Nemesis was the boss battle in each one of his forms. So I don't know if maybe that kind of helped with Nemesis's recognizability throughout the series. He's been in a million different games outside of Resident Evil.
He was in Marvel vs. Capcom 3.
Yeah, which is amazing.
And I guess that is part of it, right? I think people who are critical of the remake are saying Nemesis isn't really as cool as Mr. X from Resident Evil 2 remake. It's weird to see these parallels where Resident Evil 3 did some groundbreaking things for all of Resident Evil, right? But it kind of still gets on a little bit.
Yeah.
It's just a fun moment in history where this tiny game that came from almost nothing and a little bit of ingenuity and innovation, and we got a lot of changes that the series would stick to for a very long time. Every Resident Evil game after this became much more narratively driven, and it's because of Resident Evil 3 that it happened. Again, without 3, we wouldn't have gotten 4, and 4 is almost everybody's favorite Resident Evil. So thank 3 for 4, because 4 became this huge push to actually balancing the whole action and puzzle thing a little bit more. And then, 5 happened, and then 6 happened.
Yeah, how do you feel about that? The critique that Resident Evil 3 is the reason we have Resident Evil 6, right? It's where everything went downhill. This is the game that broke the franchise.
No.
I strongly disagree.
It's absolutely not the case. The reason we got more and more action games for Resident Evil as a series is predominantly because that's where the games industry was shifted. That's what was going on. We had Gears of War becoming more popular. Halo was becoming more popular. Those types of games that were heavily action-based became much, much bigger sellers than the horror franchise entirely. So, of course, they're going to make Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6, which are just guns akimbo. They just go nuts. But, then they realized after, Resident Evil 6 didn't get the best reviews, they decided to take things back. And then we got Resident Evil 7, which is a very good balance again.
I will defend RE6 personally, just because I love RE6 co-op. I think it's amazing. I think it's great. It obviously is completely way out of the realm of Resident Evil in terms of atmosphere, but I'm happy that game came out.
I will defend Resident Evil 6 for one thing and one thing only. I got to see Chris Redfield on a little rocking horse and going down a slide. That's all I needed for it to be fun for me.
Oh, that game is wild. Jeez.
Resident Evil 6 is a trip, but that's a video for another day.
Okay, before I close this video out, I just want to ask you both, as being such big fans, what is, the thing that you love most about Resident Evil 3?
For me personally, atmosphere. That's always been my favorite part about Resident Evil 3, and why it's my favorite Resident Evil is because, you walk around the streets, you hear zombies moaning in the distance, and there's just so much color to it. I just love the whole atmosphere of being in a city that's completely just destroyed by the undead.
For me, it's that little bit of extra innovation. In a year, they turned around something that was so different and took things to the nth degree. There was the whole choice mechanic to shift the narrative around. You did swap between characters, but it was a singular driving story, and they created Nemesis, one of the most memorable moments and characters in Resident Evil as a whole. And it's all just a villain, and all he says is stars the entire time. And this is one of the most memorable characters. So there's a lot of innovation in here, and it makes me feel more attached to the titular characters. It's you feel connected to Jill. You feel scared with her when you see Nemesis.
What's cool about Nemesis is you just see, even back on the PS1, even now, I feel like they did a really good job of recapturing this, but he has that sense of motivation where his literally one goal is to kill you. And you feel that throughout, and it's so apparent, and it just adds so much to the tension. And even playing that as a kid, you feel that tension. You're just I need to get the hell out of here. This dude is gonna destroy me.
Yeah, in the other games, there's lickers, there's zombies, there's, Crimson Heads and all these different things, but they are where they are. You don't know where Nemesis is.
And even back then with the fixed camera angles, I remember you'd walk into a room and you don't see him, but you hear his theme kick in. You hear the music. And you even hear him say stars, and you're just, it's on. That is, yeah, oh God.
That's all really, really well said. We're going to have a review of Resident Evil 3 Remake, so I don't want to get too into it. But I think part of the issue with some of the critics being hard on Resident Evil 3 Remake is that they're reviewing that game against the hopes and dreams of what a remake can be, based on the initial leaps and bounds of RE2 Remake. So I kind of get that, but, like we said, if it wasn't for the original RE3, a lot of the things people like about RE2 Remake wouldn't even exist, like Mr. X, right? And that said, it's probably going to be a better experience if you go into Resident Evil 3 Remake just judging it on its own merits as a game with its own history and kind of a place in time. And sure, maybe the improvements aren't as vast or innovative as Resident Evil 2 Remake, but, we can still play an updated version of Resident Evil 3 with a wild Nemesis chasing you all around, without tank controls, and it has updated graphics and visuals, and it does tie into the lore that was set in place by Resident Evil 2 Remake. It is still kind of cool, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But I will, however, defend tank controls till my dying breath.
As will I.
Thanks for watching, everyone. Let us know if we missed any cool Resident Evil related history in the comments, or maybe there's another polarizing game you'd like us to cover in the future. I can't make any promises, but while you're passing the time waiting around on the off chance that we might talk about your suggestion, you can go and check out the newest episode of our podcast, Send News, that comes out every Friday, and we'll be live streaming on Rooster Teeth. Come check us out on RTTV throughout the week. Thanks again for watching, and I really do appreciate all your comments Yeah, I guess even the ones calling me an idiot for having an unpopular take.
Cancel this man. Cancel him now.
Look,
Cancel him.
I meant at launch, all right? I was talking about
Send your fan
Sony,
cams to
Xbox,
@Darth
and
Burrito.
people just hear what they want, I guess. I don't know. Stay safe. Be nicer. I'll see you next time.
Well, it's no secret that Capcom had some growing pains with the Resident Evil series not very long ago. After the original trilogy and spin-offs, they started to take some serious risks once Resident Evil 4 was released in 2005. To many fans' shock, the fixed camera angles were replaced with a third-person perspective, and aside from that, the overall gameplay changed up significantly, bringing in a more fast-paced experience